My wife looked at my 16-year-old son and said, "You need to find somewhere else to live because this is my house now." I married my wife 2 years ago after dating her for 3 years. She knew from the beginning that I had a son from my first marriage. His name is Caleb, and he was 13 when we started dating and 14 when I proposed. She always said she loved him like her own. She said she couldn't wait to be a real family. She said all the right things, and I believed every word because I wanted to believe them. My first wife left when Caleb was 4 years old, and I'd been raising him alone ever since. The idea of having a partner who wanted to be part of our little family felt like a dream come true. We got married in a small ceremony at a vineyard, and Caleb stood beside me as my best man. He gave a toast about how happy he was that his dad finally found someone who made him smile again. My wife cried during his speech. I thought those tears were real. After the wedding, my wife moved into the house I'd owned for 12 years. It was the house where I'd raised Caleb and the house my grandmother had left me when she passed away. My wife didn't contribute to the mortgage because there was no mortgage. She didn't pay property taxes because I handled those. She paid for groceries sometimes and covered the internet bill and acted like that made us equal partners in the household. I didn't mind because I loved her, and I thought we were building a life together. When I look back now, I can see the small things I chose not to see at the time. During the 3 years we dated, my wife was careful. She was patient and warm, and she said the right things at the right moments. She brought Caleb little gifts, a video game he wanted, a hoodie from a band he liked, and she asked him questions about his friends and his classes. She made a show of remembering the names of his teachers. She laughed at his jokes even when they weren't funny. I watched her do all of this, and I thought I was watching a woman fall in love with a family. I know now that I was watching a performance, but back then it looked like everything I'd wanted for Caleb since his mother walked out the door. I'd spent 9 years being the only person in his corner, packing his lunches and coaching his soccer teams and sitting through parent conferences alone. And here was someone who seemed to want to share that weight with me. I would have believed anything she told me because I was tired of doing it by myself. There were moments during those dating years that should have stopped me. Once, when Caleb was 12, he spilled soda on her car seat by accident, and I saw something flash across her face before she smiled and said it was fine. It was a small thing, a flicker, gone in a second. Another time she made a joke about how she couldn't wait until Caleb was old enough to fend for himself so we could travel like a real couple. I laughed because she said it like a joke, and I told myself it was just a joke. She used to frame trips as something the two of us should do alone, romantic weekends where Caleb would stay with my brother, and she'd talk about them like they were the most natural thing in the world. I thought she was trying to nurture our relationship. I didn't understand that she was quietly building a world where my son was the thing standing in the way of it. The problem started small once she moved in. She'd complain that Caleb was too loud when he had friends over. She'd say he took too long in the shower in the mornings and used up all the hot water. She'd mention that teenage boys ate too much food and that the grocery bill had gone up since she moved in. I reminded her that Caleb had lived here his whole life and that he wasn't going anywhere. She'd nod and say she understood and then bring it up again a week later. It was always framed reasonably. She wasn't cruel about it, not at first. She'd say things like she just wanted the house to run smoothly, or that she thought it would be good for Caleb to learn some structure, or that in her family, everyone pulled their weight from a young age. Each comment on its own sounded like a person adjusting to a new living situation. It was only later that I understood they weren't separate comments at all. They were a campaign, and each one was a brick in a wall she was building between me and my son. When Caleb turned 15, she started pushing harder. She said he was old enough to get a job and pay for his own things. I said he was a sophomore in high school and his job was to focus on his grades and his sport. She said I was coddling him and that he needed to learn responsibility. I said he was responsible, that he made honor roll every semester and never gave me a moment of trouble, and that she needed to back off. She didn't back off. She started making comments directly to Caleb. She'd ask him when he was planning to move out. She'd tell him that most kids his age were already thinking about their futures and how they were going to support themselves. She mentioned that her parents made her pay rent when she turned 16, and it was the best thing that ever happened to her. She said it built character. She said it in front of me like it was wisdom she was generously passing down, and I didn't catch the way Caleb went quiet every time she did. Caleb started spending more time in his room. He stopped coming downstairs for family dinners. He stopped talking to me about his day because he didn't want to run into her in the kitchen. He'd wait until he heard her go into the bedroom before he came down to grab food, and he'd take it back upstairs and eat alone with his door closed. I watched my bright, easygoing son turn quiet and withdrawn, and I blamed myself for not seeing it sooner. I told myself he was just being a teenager. I told myself all teenagers pull away from their parents and hole up in their rooms and stop wanting to be around adults. I convinced myself it was normal because the alternative, that the woman I'd married was slowly making my son feel unwelcome in his own home, was something I wasn't ready to face. So I let it slide. I let a lot of things slide, and I will spend a long time living with that. Last month, everything came to a breaking point. Caleb was in the living room doing homework when my wife came home from work. She walked in and saw him sitting on the couch, and something in her face changed. She told him to go to his room because she wanted to watch her show. Caleb said he was almost done with his assignment and asked for 10 more minutes. She said this was her house and she didn't need to negotiate with a child. Caleb looked at me standing in the doorway. I told my wife that Caleb could finish his homework and that she could watch TV in the bedroom. She turned to me and said she was tired of tiptoeing around a kid who wasn't even hers. She said she'd been patient for 2 years and she was done pretending. She looked at Caleb and told him he needed to find somewhere else to live because this was her house now. Caleb's face crumpled. He grabbed his laptop and his books and went upstairs, and I heard his door close, not with a slam but with a quiet click that was somehow worse. I stood there there looking at the woman I'd married and realized I didn't recognize her anymore. I asked her what made her think this was her house. She said we were married, so everything that was mine was hers too. I asked her if she'd read the prenup she signed before our wedding. Her face changed. I reminded her that my grandmother's house was protected as separate property and that she had no legal claim to it whatsoever. She said prenups could be challenged. I said she was welcome to try, but that she should probably talk to a lawyer first because she might be surprised by what she'd agreed to. I told her she had 30 days to find somewhere else to live. She laughed and said I couldn't kick her out of her own home. I told her again that it wasn't her home and that it never had been. She said I was bluffing and that I'd never choose a teenager over my wife. I told her that teenager was my son and that I would choose him over anyone in the world, including her. She didn't believe me. She thought I'd calm down and change my mind. She thought I'd realize I needed her. She went to bed that night like nothing had happened. I didn't sleep in our bed. I went upstairs and knocked on Caleb's door and asked if I could come in. He was sitting on the floor with his back against his bed and his knees pulled up to his chest, and he looked younger than 16. He looked like the little boy I used to carry up the stairs when he fell asleep in the car. I sat down next to him on the floor and I told him I was sorry. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he asked me if she was really going to make him leave. I told him that no one was going to make him leave, that this was his home and always would be, and that she was the one who was leaving. He looked at me like he wanted to believe me but couldn't quite let himself. I stayed on that floor with him until he fell asleep, and then I got a blanket and I slept on the air mattress in his room because I wanted him to know, when he woke up, that I hadn't gone anywhere. Looking back, I can line up the specific moments like beads on a string, though at the time each one felt small enough to let go. There was the night I came home late from a work dinner and found Caleb's plate in the sink, untouched food scraped into the trash, and when I asked about it, my wife said he'd been rude at the table and she'd told him to eat in his room, and I let it go because I was tired, and she said it so reasonably. There was the weekend she rearranged the whole house while Caleb was at a friend's, and when he came back, his spot on the couch, the corner he'd claimed since he was a kid, had a new chair in it, her chair, and his stuff was gone, and she called it redecorating, and I called it redecorating too because I didn't want to see it for what it was. There was the time she signed us up for a couples trip over Caleb's fall break so that he'd have to spend the week at my brother's, and when I said maybe we should bring him, she looked at me like I'd suggested something absurd and said we deserved time as a couple, and I felt guilty for even asking, guilty for wanting my own son along. There was the birthday I already mentioned, the cake comment, the disappearing act. There was the parent-teacher conference she insisted on attending, and then spent complaining to the teacher about how hard it was to motivate a boy with no drive in front of Caleb, while I sat there and said nothing because I didn't want to make a scene. There were the small economies she introduced that only ever seemed to apply to him, the store brand version of the cereal he liked, while she kept buying the name brand of everything she liked, the thermostat rules that meant his room was always a little too cold, the way she'd volunteer him for chores and then criticize how he did them. Each of these on its own I could explain away, and I did, over and over, because the explaining was easier than the alternative. The alternative meant admitting that the woman I'd married didn't like my son, had maybe never liked my son, and had married me anyway. And what did that make me? That I hadn't seen it, that I'd walked my kid into it and locked the door behind us. The cruelest part, the part I understand better now, is how much of it was designed to be invisible to me and unmistakable to him. When I was in the room, she was warm. She'd ask Caleb about his day. She'd laugh at his jokes. She'd rest her hand on my arm and look like a woman who'd found her family. The coldness came out in the gaps, in the hours I was at work, in the minute after I left a room, in the look that dropped over her face like a shade the instant my attention was elsewhere. She built a private world for the two of them, one where the rules were different and the temperature was colder, and she made sure Caleb understood that if he tried to describe that world to me, it would be his word against hers, and hers came with a smile, and mine came from a resentful teenager, and who was I going to believe? She was, in her way, betting on me, betting that I wanted the happy family badly enough that I'd choose not to look too closely. For 2 years, she won that bet. What she didn't count on was that there's a line, and when she finally said it out loud, when she looked at my child and told him to leave his own home, she crossed it, and once it was crossed, I could never uncross it, and neither could she. The next morning, I called a locksmith and had all the locks changed while my wife was at work. The locksmith finished at 2:00 in the afternoon and handed me 3 new keys. I paid him in cash and watched him drive away. My phone started ringing before I even got back inside. My wife's name flashed on the screen. I let it go to voicemail. She called again. I declined it. She called a 3rd time and I turned the sound off completely. By 4 hours, she'd called me 37 times. I knew because I checked the call log while sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop open. Each voicemail was longer and angrier than the last one. The first few were confused, asking why her key wasn't working and telling me to call her back. Then they shifted to demanding I stop playing games and let her into her house. By message 20, she was yelling that I couldn't lock her out of her own home and she'd call the police if I didn't open the door immediately. I saved every single message. I opened a new folder on my computer and labeled it documentation. I backed up the voicemails to 3 different locations, one on the laptop, one on a cloud drive, and one on a small flash drive I put in the back of a kitchen drawer. Then I texted her one sentence telling her she could collect her work clothes from the porch, but she wasn't coming inside. She called again. I didn't answer. Caleb came downstairs around 5 o'clock and asked if everything was okay. I told him the locks were changed and his stepmother knew it. He nodded slowly and asked if she was going to come to the house. I told him she might, and that if she did, he didn't have to talk to her or see her, that he could stay in his room and I would handle it. He asked me what would happen if she wouldn't leave. I told him I'd already talked to a locksmith and I was going to talk to a lawyer, and that there were people who whose whole job was to make sure things like this got handled the right way. He seemed to relax a little at the idea that this was a problem with a process and a solution, and not just a thing that was going to hang over us forever. He went back upstairs, and a few minutes later I heard music playing softly through his door, which was the first time in weeks I'd heard him play music at all. At 7 high, I heard a car door slam in the driveway. Heavy footsteps crossed the porch. Then the pounding started. My wife's fist hit the door so hard the frame shook. She was yelling my name and demanding I let her in. She said I was being crazy and unreasonable, and she just wanted to talk. The pounding got louder. She kicked the door twice. I heard her swearing, and then her voice got closer to the door like she was pressing her face against it. She said I couldn't do this to her, and she lived here, and I was going to regret making her look like a fool in front of everyone. Caleb appeared at the top of the stairs. His face was pale and his hands were shaking. I went up and put my arm around him and walked him back to my bedroom and closed the door. We sat on my bed listening to her rage on the front porch. She pounded and yelled for 20 minutes straight. Then everything went quiet. I heard her car start and the sound of gravel crunching as she backed out of the driveway too fast. Caleb stayed frozen on the edge of my bed for a long time after the sound of her car faded. Then he looked at me with tears in his eyes and asked if I really meant what I said about choosing him over anyone. His voice cracked on the last word. I pulled him into a hug and felt his whole body shaking against mine. He was almost as tall as me now, this kid I used to hold in one arm, and I could feel how scared he still was underneath all that height. I told him he'd been my priority since the day he was born, and I was sorry it took me this long to prove it. He started crying then, not the quiet tears he'd been holding back for months, but real sobbing that shook his shoulders. Boys his age don't cry in front of their fathers, not usually, not anymore, and the fact that he let himself do it told me how much he'd been carrying alone. I held him and let him cry and told him I should have seen it sooner. He cried for what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 minutes. When he finally pulled back, his face was blotchy and his eyes were red, but he looked lighter somehow, like something heavy had come loose. We stayed up until past midnight talking. He told me about all the small things I hadn't noticed, how she'd sigh dramatically whenever he spoke at dinner, how she'd forget to make him a plate when I worked late, even though she always made one for herself, how she'd turn the volume up on her show when he was trying to study in the living room, how she'd make comments about him eating too much, or taking too long in the shower, or leaving his cleats by the door of her house. Every story he shared made my chest hurt worse. I kept apologizing and he kept saying it wasn't my fault, but we both knew I should have protected him better. He told me that for a long time he'd thought he was imagining it, that he'd wondered if he was being too sensitive, and that hearing me say the locks were changed had been the first time he felt like maybe he wasn't crazy. That was the sentence that stayed with me all night, the idea that my son had spent 2 years wondering if the thing happening to him was real, because the adult who was supposed to be watching had been looking the other way. Over the next 3 days, my wife switched tactics completely. The angry calls stopped and the texts started. Long paragraphs about how she'd overreacted, and she loved our family, and she was willing to go to counseling. She said Caleb had misunderstood her intentions, and she was just trying to teach him responsibility like any good parent would. She said she'd been stressed at work and took it out on us, but she was going to do better. She said we could work through this if I just gave her a chance. Each message was carefully worded and reasonable sounding. I read them and recognized the pattern I'd been missing for 2 years. The way she was rewriting what happened, making herself the victim of a misunderstanding instead of the person who told a 16-year-old boy to leave his own home, making her cruelty sound like tough love, making my protection of my son sound like an overreaction. I responded once. I told her the 30-day notice stood and all further communication needed to be in writing through lawyers. She called immediately. I didn't answer. She sent 5 more texts that got progressively less reasonable, and by the last one, she dropped the therapy language entirely and was back to telling me I'd regret this. I saved all of them in my documentation folder. My friend Paul had recommended a family law attorney named Diane Fowler. I called her office on Monday morning and explained my situation to the receptionist. She squeezed me in for Thursday afternoon. Diane's office was in a converted house downtown with hardwood floors and bookshelves covering every wall. She was maybe 50 with silver hair pulled back and sharp eyes that didn't miss anything. I sat across from her desk and handed her a copy of my prenup. She read through it carefully while I tried not to fidget. After 10 minutes, she looked up and told me my house was completely protected as separate property and my wife had no legal claim to it whatsoever. The relief that washed through me made my hands shake. She explained the separation and divorce process step by step. She warned me that my wife would likely escalate when she realized I was serious about ending the marriage. She asked if she'd ever been violent, and I said no, but she'd been emotionally abusive to my son. She asked me to describe what that looked like, and as I listed the things Caleb had told me, the sighing, the withheld meals, the constant comments about money and moving out, I watched her write it all down and I realized for the first time how long the list actually was. She helped me start documenting everything for a potential restraining order. When I walked out of her office an hour later, I felt scared, but also clear-headed for the first time since I'd said I do 2 years ago. My wife refused to look for a new place or pack any of her belongings. She acted like the 30-day notice was just me being dramatic, and I'd change my mind any day now. She was staying at her friend Bianca's place across town, but she kept showing up at random times trying to talk sense into me. She'd park across the street and sit in her car for an hour. She'd text me photos of the two of us from happier days with captions about how we were throwing away something real. She had a way of making it sound like I was the one breaking the family apart, like Caleb and I were the problem, and she was just trying to hold everything together. On day 12, I was making lunch when I heard a key in the lock. lock. My blood went cold before I remembered I'd changed them. The door handle rattled. Then my wife's face appeared in the kitchen window. Caleb was sitting at the table doing homework. He froze when he saw her. She tapped on the glass and gestured for me to let her in. I shook my head. She started talking through the window about how teenagers need tough love and structure, and I was doing Caleb a disservice by coddling him. Her voice was muffled, but I could hear every word. I walked over and physically positioned myself between the window and Caleb. I told her to leave immediately. Something in my voice must have gotten through because she actually stopped talking. She stared at me for a long moment and then walked back to her car without another word. My father called me that evening. He said my wife had contacted him claiming I'd had some kind of breakdown and thrown her out for no reason. He suggested marriage counseling. He reminded me how hard it had been to raise Caleb alone all those years and how much happier I'd seemed after I met her. I felt the old guilt rising up in my chest, the fear that maybe I was overreacting, the worry that I was making a terrible mistake and tearing apart the one good thing I'd found. Then I remembered Caleb's crumpled face when she told him to leave. I told my father he didn't have all the information, and I needed him to trust my judgment on this. He went quiet. Then he said he hoped I knew what I was doing and hung up. The conversation left me feeling shaky and uncertain, the way I always felt after my father made it clear he thought I was making the wrong choice. I called Paul and told him what happened. He reminded me that my father hadn't seen what I'd seen, and he didn't know how Caleb had been suffering. That helped more than I expected. Paul had known me since college. He'd been at the hospital the day Caleb was born, and he told me flat out that in all the years he'd known me, he'd never seen me sharper or more sure than I'd been these last 2 weeks, and that whatever else I wasn't a man having a breakdown. Diane had assigned a paralegal named Theo to help with my case. He called me the following week and asked if I wanted to understand my wife's financial situation better. He said it might help explain why she was fighting so hard to stay in my house. I met Theo at a coffee shop near the courthouse. He was younger than I expected, maybe 30, with glasses and a laptop covered in stickers. He pulled up credit reports and account statements he'd obtained through discovery requests. What he showed me made everything click into place. My wife had been living beyond her means for years. Credit card debt over $40,000, lease payments on a car she couldn't really afford, personal loans she'd taken out to cover other loans. Her salary was decent, but not enough to support her lifestyle and pay rent anywhere on her own. My house had been subsidizing everything. I'd been providing free housing while she spent her entire paycheck on herself, on clothes and trips and dinners out, and a storage unit full of things I never even knew she'd bought. The discovery made me feel vindicated, but also used. I realized she might have proposed the idea of us moving fast, of getting married sooner rather than later, partly because marrying me solved her money problems. Theo printed everything out for my records. I added it all to my documentation folder, and I noticed the folder was getting thick now, that what had started as a few voicemails had become a whole file of evidence, and there was something steadying about that, about watching the truth pile up in a place where no one could argue it away. 2 days later, I got a call from Caleb's school. The counselor's name was Nadia Foster, and her voice was gentle but concerned. She told me that Caleb had broken down crying during a class where they were writing personal essays for college applications. When asked about his home life, Nadia said she wished someone had reached out sooner because Caleb had been showing signs of anxiety all semester, pulling away from his friends, letting his grades slip in a way that didn't match the student she'd seen the year before. My guilt crashed over me so hard I had to sit down. I'd been so focused on making my marriage work that I'd missed my own son falling apart right in front of me. Nadia reassured me that recognizing the problem and taking action was what mattered now. She said Caleb had mentioned that things were better at home recently, that his dad was on his side, and she said he'd seemed relieved when he talked about it. That helped a little, but I still felt like I'd failed the one person who'd always depended on me. I asked her if there was anything I should be doing, and she gave me the name of a therapist who worked with teenagers, and I wrote it down and told her I'd call that afternoon, and I did. On day 31, I came home from work at 5:30. Caleb had soccer practice until 6, so the house should have been empty. But when I opened the door, I heard the TV on in the living room. My wife was sitting on the couch with her feet on my coffee table like she owned the place. My heart started racing. She looked up at me and said she still had a key, so technically she wasn't trespassing. I realized she must have made a copy before I changed the locks. She said I'd had my tantrum and now we needed to talk like adults about our marriage. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were hard. I didn't say anything. I just turned around and walked back out to my car. I called Caleb and told him to go to Paul's house after practice and to wait for me there. Then I called the police for my car and reported that my separated wife had entered my home after being given written notice to stay away. 2 officers showed up within 20 minutes. I waited in my car until they arrived. They went inside and I heard raised voices. My wife came out 10 minutes later with the officers behind her. She glared at me as she walked past my car and mouthed something I couldn't hear. One of the officers came over and took my statement. She asked if I wanted to press charges. I said yes. She gave me a case number and told me to contact a lawyer about a restraining order. After they left, I sat in my driveway for another hour before I felt steady enough to go inside. The next morning, I called Diane. She said she'd been expecting this. We filed for a restraining order that afternoon. The court hearing was scheduled for 5 days later. Diane spent 3 hours preparing me for what to expect. I had to write down every threatening message, every boundary violation, every time Caleb had felt unsafe in his own home. Putting it all in writing made the pattern impossible to deny, but I was scared the judge wouldn't take it seriously enough because my wife had never actually hit anyone. There's a thing people don't say out loud, which is that when a woman does this to a man and his son, some people assume it can't be that bad, that a man should just handle it, that whatever a wife did couldn't really have hurt a father and a teenage boy. I was scared the judge would think that. Diane said emotional abuse and harassment were valid grounds for protection orders, regardless of who was doing it to whom. She said judges were getting better at recognizing patterns of control and intimidation. I wanted to believe her, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking as I signed all the paperwork. The restraining order paperwork sat in my email inbox for 2 days before my wife found out about it. I don't know how she got the information so fast, but she must have been checking court records, or maybe her lawyer told her. Within hours of the filing becoming public, my phone started buzzing with messages from people I hadn't talked to in months. The first one came from Greg, a guy from the rec league basketball team I used to play on with my wife's crowd, someone I'd gotten close to during the early days of my marriage. He sent a long text about how shocked he was to hear what was happening, and how he always thought we were such a solid couple. He asked if we could talk because he wanted to understand my side of things. I called him that evening and tried to explain the situation without going into too much detail about Caleb's experiences, because it felt wrong to hand my son's private pain around to people who might repeat it. Greg kept interrupting to say that marriage was hard and that everyone went through rough patches. He said he and his own wife had said some harsh things to each other over the years, but they worked through it. I realized he wasn't actually listening to what I was telling him. He'd already decided I was overreacting before he even picked up the phone. 2 more friends reached out over the next week with similar messages. They'd talked to my wife or heard her version from someone else, and they wanted to know why I was being so extreme. One of them actually used the word vindictive when he asked why I was trying to keep her away from her own stepson. I stopped responding after that because I knew anything I said would get twisted and shared with people who'd already made up their minds. It's a strange thing to watch, the way a story travels. My wife had spent 2 years being charming to all these people, and now she was spending my credibility like it was money she'd saved up for exactly this. She told them I'd lost it, that I'd become paranoid, that I was using Caleb as an excuse to end a marriage I'd gotten cold feet about, and because she was the one who called them first, her version got there first, and first is a hard thing to beat. My brother, Daniel, called on a Thursday night after he heard about the restraining order through our father. He didn't ask for my side of the story, or question my decisions. He just said he was proud of me for protecting Caleb, and that he'd been worried about my wife for a while. I asked him what he meant, and he said there were little things he'd noticed at family gatherings, the way my wife would make comments about Caleb's appearance or his friends or his grades, always with a smile, always in a tone that let her deny she meant anything by it. Daniel said he'd almost said something a few times but didn't want to overstep. I told him I wished he had. He reminded me that I probably wouldn't have listened back then because I was still trying to make the marriage work. He was right about that. Daniel told me that anyone who sided with my wife without asking questions wasn't really my friend anyway. He said real friends trusted your judgment and supported your choices, even when they didn't understand all the details. That conversation helped more than he probably knew because I was starting to feel like maybe I was the problem. Losing those friendships hurt in a way I didn't expect. These were people I'd shared meals with and watched games with and stood next to at each other's weddings. Now they were treating me like I'd done something wrong by protecting my son. I kept thinking about all the times I'd shown up for them, helped one of them move, sat with another one in a hospital waiting room, covered a bar tab when someone was between jobs, all without ever questioning what they told me they needed. The double standard made me angry, but it also made me sad because it showed me how little they actually knew me. I think part of what my wife understood, better than I did, was that most people don't want the complicated version of a story. They want the version that lets them keep believing the world makes sense. And a devoted wife wronged by a paranoid husband was a simpler story than the one that was actually true. The story didn't stay contained to phone calls between old friends. About a week after the restraining order was filed, my wife posted about it online. It was a long, careful post, the kind that never names anyone directly but leaves no doubt about who it's about. She wrote about heartbreak, about giving everything to a marriage only to be discarded, about a man who had let her raise his difficult child and then thrown her out the moment she asked for a little respect and structure in return. She wrote about being locked out of her own home, about police being called on her for simply wanting to talk, about how the person you trust most can turn cold and cruel overnight. She was good at it. She'd always been good at it. The post got hundreds of reactions, long comment threads full of people who didn't know a single true thing about my life, telling her how strong she was, how brave, how they couldn't imagine what kind of monster would do this to such a loving wife. I found out about it because Caleb found out about it first. A kid at school showed him, because of course a kid at school showed him, because the internet is a small town now and nothing stays quiet. He came home that day pale and shaking, in a way I hadn't seen since the night she pounded on the door, and he handed me his phone without a word. I read the post standing in the kitchen while he watched my face. What got to me most wasn't the lies about me. I could take those. What got to me was the line where she called him difficult, where she made my son, my kind, careful, wounded son, the villain of her story, the excuse for everything, the problem she'd nobly tried to solve. He'd read that. He'd stood in a school hallway and read a grown woman tell the internet that he was the reason her marriage fell apart, and hundreds of strangers had agreed with her. I put the phone down and I sat him at the kitchen table and I told him the truth, which was that none of it was real, that a person who tells the truth doesn't need to hide behind a vague post designed to collect sympathy from strangers, and that everything she'd written was a mirror, that every cruel thing she accused me of was a thing she had done, and every burden she claimed he'd been was really a description of how she'd treated him. I told him that the people cheering her on in the comments would forget the whole thing by next week, that they weren't real, that they were just faces on a screen looking for a story to feel something about, and that their opinion of him was worth exactly nothing because they didn't know him. I told him the people who actually knew him. Me, his coach, his real friends, his Uncle Daniel, Nadia at school. We all knew exactly who he was, and no post could touch that. He nodded, but I could tell it had landed somewhere deep, and I was angry in a way I hadn't let myself be through any of the rest of it, because there is a specific kind of rage a parent feels when someone reaches through a screen to hurt their kid. I sent the post to Diane. She told me to screenshot everything, the post, the comments, the dates, and to add it to the file, and she said something that helped me put my anger somewhere useful. She said the post was a gift, legally speaking, that a person under a restraining order publicly airing details of the case and painting the protected parties in a false and damaging light was not the behavior of the sympathetic victim my wife was trying to play, and that if this ever went further, that post would sit in a folder with her name on it and speak louder than anything she could say in a cardigan. So I stopped reading the comments and I started documenting them, and the act of turning the thing that hurt into evidence that helped was, in a strange way, the same lesson I'd been learning all along. You don't have to win the argument, you just have to keep the record. The post did something my wife didn't expect. It backfired, slowly at first, and then all at once. A few people who knew both of us and knew more than she'd assumed started asking questions in the comments, gently at first, then less gently. Someone who'd been at a family gathering mentioned they'd seen her make comments about Caleb that didn't match the loving stepmother story. Someone else pointed out that a woman genuinely locked out of a home she owned would call a lawyer, not the internet. The thread that was supposed to canonize her as a victim started to fray, and within a couple of days she took the whole thing down. But the internet is a small town, and by then people had seen it, and screenshots existed, and the story that spread after the deletion was not the story she'd wanted. The story that spread was that she'd posted a big dramatic public complaint, and then quietly erased it when people started poking holes. And that story was, if anything, more damaging to her than silence would have been. Around the same time, Theo called me with something else, and this one hit harder than the post. When he'd first pulled my wife's financial records, we'd focused on her debt, the $40,000 in credit cards, the loans, the lifestyle my house had been subsidizing. But as the divorce moved forward and discovery went deeper, he found something we'd missed. During the marriage, my wife had opened a credit card in both our names, using our marriage and my information, and she'd never told me. She'd been running a balance on it, and because it was a joint account, the debt on it was potentially something I could be held responsible for. And worse, her missed payments on it had started to show up on my credit report. The woman who told my son he cost too much money had quietly been spending money in my name, building a debt I hadn't agreed to and didn't know existed, tying her sinking finances to mine so that when she went down she'd take a piece of me with her. I felt sick when Theo explained it, sicker than I'd felt about almost anything else, because it was so cold, so premeditated. This wasn't a comment made in a bad moment. This was a woman who had sat down, filled out an application, forged a shared future she was already planning to abandon, and used the person who trusted her as collateral. Theo walked me through what to do. We disputed the account. We documented that it had been opened and used without my knowledge or consent. We gathered the records that showed the pattern, and we folded all of it into the divorce filing as evidence of financial misconduct. It took months to fully unwind, months of letters to credit bureaus and calls with fraud departments and careful, patient paperwork, but we unwound it. Theo told me later that this was often how these things went, that people like my wife rarely had just one scheme, that the cruelty toward the child and the sabotage of the finances came from the same place, a fundamental willingness to use other people as means to an end. Finding the second scheme made the first one make more sense. She had never been building a family. She had been acquiring a house and a bank account, and my son had simply been in the way. I made a decision, sitting in that coffee shop with Theo and his sticker-covered laptop, that I wasn't going to hide any of this from Caleb, not the parts he was old enough to understand, not the ugly financial details, not the smear post, not the arrest when it came. I'd spent 2 years protecting a version of the story where everything was fine, and that protection had cost my son more than the truth ever would have. So I told him, in the kitchen, over the dinner he'd cooked, what she'd done with the credit card, in language a 17-year-old could follow, and instead of being frightened by it, he seemed almost relieved, because it confirmed something he'd felt for a long time and never had words for. He said quietly that he'd always known she didn't really love us, that he'd felt it in the way she looked at both of us when she thought no one was watching, and that hearing all of this just made the feeling into a fact. I told him I was sorry it had taken me so long to see what a 14-year-old had felt in his gut. He shrugged and said I saw it eventually, and that eventually was better than never, and that a lot of kids never got the parent who finally chose them. I've thought about that sentence more times than I can count. He forgave me faster and more completely than I have managed to forgive myself. Caleb came into my room one night about a week after the restraining order was filed. It was late, almost 11 o'clock, and I was lying in bed staring at my phone trying to decide whether to respond to another concerned message from someone who clearly thought I was making a mistake. He knocked softly and asked if he could come in. I put the phone down and told him, of course. He sat on the edge of my bed and picked at the comforter for a minute without saying anything. Then he looked at me and said he needed to tell me something he'd never told anyone before. My stomach dropped because I knew whatever came next was going to be bad. He started talking about the last 2 years and all the things my wife had done when I wasn't around. She told him he was the reason we couldn't take vacations because he cost too much money. She said it multiple times, always when I was at work or out running errands. She'd bring up how much cheaper life would be without a teenager in the house, how much sooner she and I could retire, how many things we could do if we weren't paying for his food and his cleats and his phone. Caleb said he started feeling guilty every time I bought him new clothes or paid a fee for his soccer team because he knew she was keeping track track of every dollar spent on him. He told me he'd started buying his own stuff with the money he made mowing lawns in the summer, not because he wanted to, but because he couldn't stand the way she looked at him when I paid for something. He was 15 years old and he was trying to make himself cost less, so the woman living in my house would stop resenting him. I don't think I've ever felt anything like what I felt when he told me that. He told me about the nights when I worked late and my wife would make dinner for herself, but forget to make him a plate. He'd come downstairs hungry and find her eating in front of the TV, and when he asked if there was anything for him, she'd act surprised and say she thought he'd already eaten, or that she didn't realize he'd be hungry, or that there were things in the fridge he could figure out himself. It happened enough times that he started keeping protein bars and instant noodles in his room so he wouldn't have to go downstairs and ask. He showed me, later, the little stash in his desk drawer, and I had to leave the room for a minute so he wouldn't see my face. He described the way she'd sigh whenever he spoke at the dinner table. This long dramatic exhale, like listening to him, was physically exhausting. She did it so consistently that he stopped talking during meals unless I asked him a direct question. He thought maybe he was being too sensitive until he noticed she never sighed when I was talking, only when he was. The full picture of her calculated campaign to make him feel unwelcome in his own home broke something in me. These weren't just moments of frustration or adjustment struggles like I'd told myself. This was deliberate and sustained emotional cruelty, designed to push a child out of his own house so that a grown woman could have his father and his father's home all to herself. I apologized to Caleb for not seeing it sooner and for not protecting him the way I should have. He said it wasn't my fault because she was careful to only do these things when I wasn't watching. He said she was different when I was in the room, warmer, softer, and that for a long time he'd been afraid to tell me because he thought I'd think he was making it up, or that I'd have to choose between him and her, and he was scared I'd choose her. That admission hurt worse than anything else because it meant my son had been living with that fear for 2 years. The fear that his own father would pick a woman he'd known for 5 years over the boy he'd raised for 16. I pulled him into a hug and promised him that I would always choose him, that there was no universe where I would pick anyone over my own child, and that I was ashamed it had ever been a question. We stayed up talking until almost 2 out in the morning, and he told me more stories that made me want to go back in time and throw her out the day she first made him feel small. There was one more thing he told me that night near the end, when he was almost too tired to keep talking. He said that a few months earlier, on a day when I'd been away for a work trip, he'd come home from school to find some of his things missing from the living room. A game console he kept hooked up to the main TV, a couple of his soccer trophies that had been on the mantle since he was 10. When he asked her about it, she said she'd boxed them up and put them in the garage because the living room was an adult space now, and it was time he kept his childish things in his room. He said he didn't tell me when I got back because I seemed happy to be home, and he didn't want to start a fight. He'd gone out to the garage that night and found the box and carried it up to his room himself, and he'd been keeping his trophies on his windowsill ever since, out of sight, where she couldn't decide they didn't belong. I got up the next morning and went into the garage, and there were more boxes out there than I remembered, and when I opened them, I found other pieces of my son's childhood that had quietly disappeared from the shared parts of the house, packed away like evidence of a life she was trying to edit out. I brought all of it back inside, and I put every trophy back on the mantle where it belonged. The restraining order hearing happened on a Tuesday morning at 9 Mike. Diane met me outside the courthouse at 8:30 to go over everything one more time. She reminded me to stay calm and stick to the facts no matter what my wife said or how she tried to twist things. She said the worst thing I could do was get angry because an angry man on a witness stand plays into exactly the story my wife wanted to tell, and the best thing I could do was be the calmest person in the room. We walked through security and found seats in the hallway outside the courtroom. My wife showed up 15 minutes later wearing a soft cardigan and a simple dress I'd never seen before, an outfit chosen to make her look gentle and harmless, like someone's favorite aunt. She looked reasonable and calm, like a concerned spouse who just wanted to work things out. Her lawyer was with her, a man in his 50s who kept glancing at me with an expression that seemed almost apologetic, like he already knew how this was going to go. When they called our case, we all filed into the courtroom and took our seats. The judge was a woman in her 60s with reading glasses that she kept pushing up her nose. She reviewed the paperwork for a few minutes while we sat in silence. Then she started asking my wife questions about the incident where she'd entered the house after being told to stay away. My wife's voice was steady and warm as she explained that she just wanted to talk to her husband like adults, that she'd been blindsided by all of this, that she loved our family and didn't understand why a rough patch had turned into police reports and court dates. She said she didn't realize using a key she'd had made months ago would be considered a violation of anything, because in her mind, it was still her home. The judge asked her about the 30-day notice to vacate and whether she understood that the house belonged to me as separate property. My wife's mask slipped a little bit. She referred to my house as our marital home and said that marriage meant sharing everything, that it wasn't right for a man to hide behind a piece of paper he'd made her sign before she even knew what she was agreeing to. Diane had warned me this would happen, that her sense of entitlement would show through once she started talking, and that all I had to do was let it. The judge asked her why she thought she had a right to enter a home she'd been explicitly told to leave. My wife said she was just trying to help raise a boy who badly needed structure, that I was overprotective and soft, and that Caleb was spoiled and lazy and disrespectful. She said the notice to vacate was a bluff, and she'd known me long enough to know I'd never actually go through with any of it. The judge's expression changed when my wife started talking about Caleb. She asked my wife to clarify what she meant when she told a 16-year-old to find somewhere else to live, and to explain how that squared with wanting to help raise him. My wife tried to backtrack. She said she'd been frustrated, that it had come out wrong, that of course she never meant for him to actually leave, but the words were already in the record, and the more she tried to soften them, the worse they sounded, because there is no gentle way to explain telling a child he isn't welcome in his own home. The judge granted a 6-month restraining order and ordered my wife to stay away from both me and Caleb, from the house, from Caleb's school, and from his soccer games. She said any violation would result in immediate arrest. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt like I could breathe for the first time in weeks. Diane squeezed my arm and said that went as well as we could have hoped. My wife and her lawyer left through a different exit. I didn't see her again that day. The next problem came when I tried to take my wife's name off the utility accounts. I'd assumed it would be simple since the accounts were originally in my name and the house was my property. But when I called the electric company, they told me they needed both signatures to remove an authorized user. I explained that we were separated and she'd been ordered to stay away from me. The customer service representative said she understood, but company policy required both signatures. I asked to speak to a supervisor. The supervisor repeated the same policy. I spent 3 hours on the phone that day getting nowhere, passed from department to department, explaining the same story over and over to people who were sympathetic but powerless. Theo helped me figure out a workaround. He drafted an affidavit stating that I was the sole property owner and that my wife had added her name to the accounts without my primary authorization. We attached copies of the deed, the prenup, and the restraining order. Then Theo called the utility companies himself and worked his way up the chain until he found someone willing to review the documentation. It took 3 weeks of frustrating phone calls and multiple rounds of paperwork. The electric company finally removed her name after 2 weeks. The water company took longer because they had different verification procedures. Every time I thought we'd cleared the last hurdle, another requirement would pop up. My wife refused to cooperate out of spite, ignoring calls from the utility companies and refusing to sign anything her lawyer sent over. She was leaving the accounts in limbo, hoping it would force me to contact her directly, because as long as there was one thread still connecting us, she had a reason to keep pulling on it. Theo warned me not to take the bait. He said my wife was looking for any excuse to claim I'd reached out to her first, or to reestablish a line of communication she could use, and that every unanswered call was a small victory even when it didn't feel like one. Eventually, we got everything straightened out, but it took way more time and energy than it should have. I reclaimed full control of my household accounts and had every account number changed, so my wife couldn't access any information about my usage, or my billing, or anything else about the life Caleb and I were rebuilding without her. She found other ways to reach for me. About a week into all of this, a package showed up on the porch, no return address, and inside was a framed photo of the 3 of us from the wedding, along with a card in her handwriting about how a real family doesn't give up when things get hard. I put the photo in the garage and the card in my documentation folder because Diane had told me to keep everything, that even a card that looked like a peace offering was really a boundary being tested, a way of proving she could still reach into my house whenever she wanted. A few days after that, one of the parents from Caleb's soccer team pulled me aside at a game and said my wife had messaged her, asking how Caleb was doing and whether he'd said anything about the divorce, framing it as concern, fishing for information she could use. I thanked the parent for telling me and I sent the screenshots to Theo. My wife wasn't allowed at the games anymore, but she'd found a way to stand at the edge of them anyway, through other people, still trying to keep one hand on a life that had already closed the door on her. The worst of it came when she called my workplace. She left a message with the front desk saying she was worried about me, that I'd been under enormous stress and wasn't acting like myself, and could someone please check on me. It was dressed up as concern, but the intent was obvious, to make the people I worked with wonder whether I was stable, to plant the same story with my colleagues that she'd already planted with our friends. My manager, who had known me for 8 years, told me about the call directly instead of letting it fester, and I was grateful for that. But I also spent the rest of that week feeling watched, wondering who else had heard, wondering whether the story was already spreading through the building. I told Diane, and she added it to the file and said it was actually helpful, that a pattern of contacting third parties to damage my reputation was exactly the kind of thing a judge would look at. If my wife ever tried to argue, she'd respected the order. Everything she did to hurt me, it turned out, was also evidence. I started to understand that the calmest, most useful thing I could do was simply write it all down. 2 weeks after the restraining order hearing, Diane called to tell me my wife's lawyer had sent over a letter. I asked if it was about the divorce, and she said not exactly. She read it to me over the phone. The letter proposed that we pause the divorce proceedings and try separation counseling instead. It was full of therapy language about communication breakdowns and blended family challenges. It talked about the importance of working through difficulties rather than giving up on a marriage. It suggested that with professional help, we could find better ways to address our different parenting styles. The letter completely ignored everything my wife had done to Caleb. It reframed her emotional abuse as a parenting disagreement. It made the whole situation sound like a misunderstanding that could be fixed with better communication and a good counselor. Diane said this was a common tactic to delay proceedings and maintain control. She'd seen it dozens of times in cases like mine. The goal was to make me feel guilty for not trying hard enough and to buy my wife more time to figure out her next move. She asked if I wanted to consider the proposal. I told her absolutely not. I instructed her to proceed with the divorce filing immediately. She said she'd have the papers ready by the end of the week. True to her word, she served her the following week. I got a text from Diane on a Wednesday afternoon saying the process server had delivered the papers to my wife at her office. I felt a strange mix of emotions when I read that message. Part of me was relieved that we were moving forward. Part of me was terrified of what came next. Filing for divorce made everything feel both real and final in a way that changing the locks and getting the restraining order hadn't. This was the official end of my marriage, documented in legal paperwork and court filings. My wife had 30 days to respond, and Diane expected her to fight over property division, despite the prenup clearly protecting my assets. She said people like her didn't give up easily even when they knew they had no legal ground to stand on, that for someone like my wife, the point had never really been the house or the money, the point had been winning, and being asked to walk away with nothing was going to feel to her like the worst thing that had ever happened, worse than losing the marriage itself. I spent that weekend going through wedding photos and cards. I'd stored them all in a box in my closet and hadn't looked at them since the first anniversary. I sat on my bedroom floor and went through each photo, each card, each memento from a day that was supposed to be the start of our future together. In the wedding photos, my wife looked happy and I looked hopeful. Caleb looked sharp in the suit we'd bought him for the occasion, the first real suit he'd ever owned, standing next to me with his hands folded in front of him and a smile that, looking at it now, didn't quite reach his eyes. I remembered how proud I'd been that day, how I'd thought I was giving him a mother, a real family, the thing I'd felt guilty for years about not being able to provide. We all looked like people who believed in the promises being made. I read through the cards from friends and family wishing us a lifetime of happiness. I found the toast Caleb had written and read at the reception, folded up small, about how glad he was that his dad finally found someone who made him smile again. Looking at all of it with the knowledge I had now felt like watching a different person's life. The future I'd imagined when I said I do had never existed outside my own hopeful imagination. The woman I'd married wasn't who I thought she was. Maybe she'd hidden her true nature during our dating years, kept it folded away until the ring was on and the papers were signed, and it was harder for me to walk away. Or maybe I'd been so desperate for partnership, so tired of doing everything alone, that I'd ignored the signs that were there all along. The flickers of coldness, the jokes that weren't quite jokes, the way she always seemed a little happier when Caleb wasn't around. Either way, the marriage I was mourning wasn't real. It was a story I'd told myself about who we were and what we could be. A story I'd wanted so badly to be true that I'd been willing to overlook my own son growing quieter and smaller inside it. The actual marriage, the one where my wife slowly pushed my son out of his own home while I made excuses for her. That marriage deserved to end. I put the photos and cards back in the box and stored it in the garage. Maybe someday I'd be able to look at them without feeling this particular brand of sadness. For now, I needed to focus on moving forward. Something shifted in Caleb over the next few weeks. He started smiling again, these small moments of lightness that reminded me of who he'd been before my wife moved in. He brought friends home after school without asking permission first, just walked in with 2 guys from his soccer team and headed straight to the kitchen, raiding the fridge and leaving crumbs on the counter. And I found that I loved the crumbs, that I loved every sign of a teenager living loudly in a house that was finally his again. He played music in his room loud enough that I could hear it downstairs, some song with a heavy bass line that made his door rattle in a way that would have earned a sigh and a comment a few months ago. He sprawled on the living room couch doing homework with his books spread across the cushions and his feet up on the armrest, taking up space, unafraid of being told the living room was an adult space now. Little by little, he was reclaiming his space and his confidence. I watched him laugh at something on his phone one afternoon, a real laugh, loud and unguarded, and I realized I hadn't heard him laugh like that in months. The sound made my chest feel tight in a good way. We still had hard days where he'd go quiet and withdrawn, where I could tell he was thinking about everything that happened. Some nights I'd hear him up late and I'd go sit with him, and he'd tell me about a memory that had surfaced, another small cruelty he'd never mentioned, and we'd talk it through until it lost some of its weight. The therapist Nadia had recommended was helping. He went once a week at first, and then every other week as the weeks went on, and I could see the difference in him, the way he started to trust that good things could last, that the peace in the house wasn't going to be yanked away from him the moment he let himself enjoy it. But the good days were starting to outnumber the bad ones. He talked more at dinner, telling me stories about his teachers and his friends, and a girl in his chemistry class he was too shy to talk to, without that underlying anxiety that someone was going to sigh, or tell him to be quiet, or remind him how much he cost. He asked if he could redecorate his room, get rid of the childhood furniture, and make it feel like a place that belonged to the person he was becoming. And we spent a Saturday at the home improvement store, picking out new paint colors. He chose a deep green for one wall, and we talked about mounting a shelf for the trophies I'd brought back up from the garage. We painted together over a long weekend, covering the floor with drop cloths and taping off the trim, and getting more paint on ourselves than we probably got on the walls. He put on a playlist and we sang along badly while we worked, and at one point he flicked a brush at me and got a streak of green across my shirt, and I chased him around the room with a roller until we were both laughing too hard to keep going. It felt like we were painting over more than just old wall color. We were covering up the last 2 years and starting fresh. Watching him reclaim his space and his confidence made every difficult conversation and every lost friendship worth it. We weren't all the way back to where we'd been before I met my wife, but we were heading in the right direction. The house felt lighter somehow, like a weight had been lifted that I hadn't fully realized we were carrying. A low hum of tension that had been running under everything for so long, I'd stopped hearing it until it finally stopped. I started thinking about the early days of dating my wife, trying to pinpoint when I should have known better. The red flags had been there if I'd been willing to see them. Small comments about Caleb that I'd dismissed as adjustment struggles. Jokes about teenagers being expensive that I'd laughed off because I thought she was just being funny. The way she'd suggest activities that were just the two of us, framing it as important couple time, but really carving Caleb out of our plans one weekend at a time. I'd been so grateful for adult companionship after years of single parenting that I'd minimized every concern. I'd made excuses for behavior that should have alarmed me. When she complained about Caleb being too loud, I told myself she just needed time to adjust to living with a teenager. When she suggested he get a job at 15, I convinced myself she was trying to teach him responsibility. I'd reframed every red flag as a misunderstanding or a difference in parenting styles, rather than seeing the pattern of someone who resented my son's very existence in the home she wanted for herself. Part of me wanted to beat myself up for being so blind, but my own therapist, the one I finally started seeing a few weeks in because I couldn't keep carrying all of this alone, helped me understand that recognizing manipulation didn't mean I was stupid for falling for it. She said people like my wife were skilled at presenting themselves as exactly what you needed. They said the right things and showed you the version of themselves that you wanted to see, and they saved the rest for when you were already in too deep to leave easily. The fact that I'd eventually recognized the truth and taken action was what mattered. I was learning to forgive myself for the mistake, while still acknowledging the harm it caused Caleb. That balance was hard to find. Some days I felt okay about my choices, proud even of how quickly I'd moved once I finally saw clearly. And other days I felt crushing guilt for not protecting him sooner. For the 2 years he spent hiding food in his desk drawer and shrinking himself at the dinner table while I sat right there and missed it. But I was working through it, trying to be gentler with myself, while also holding space for the reality that my decisions had consequences. Understanding that I'd been manipulated didn't erase those consequences, but it helped me move forward without getting stuck in shame. My wife did not go quietly. About 3 weeks after she was served, she violated the restraining order. It happened on a Friday evening. Caleb had a home soccer game, and even though she'd been ordered to stay away from his school and his games, she showed up. She didn't come onto the field or into the stands. She parked her car in the far corner of the lot where she could see the field through the fence, and she sat there. One of the other parents recognized her car and mentioned it to me, and I felt that old, cold drop in my stomach, the one I'd been feeling less and less. I didn't confront her. Diane had drilled that into me. I didn't walk over there and give her a scene she could twist into a story about how I'd harassed her. Instead, I took a photo of the car with the plate visible, noted the time, and told the athletic director, who told the school resource officer. The officer walked out to the lot, and by the time the game was over, my wife was gone. But the report existed, and the report was what mattered. She did it again 11 days later, and this time she wasn't as careful. She came to the house. It was a Sunday afternoon, and Caleb and I were in the backyard, and I heard a car in the driveway, and then the doorbell. And when I looked through the front window, there she was, standing on the porch holding a bag of Caleb's old things she claimed she'd found while packing, using it as an excuse to be there, to be seen there, to make me open the door. I didn't open the door. I called the non-emergency police line, and I stayed on the phone with the dispatcher, narrating what was happening in a calm, flat voice, while my wife rang the bell again and then started knocking and calling my name. Caleb stood in the kitchen doorway watching me, and I gave him a look that told him it was okay, that I had it handled, and he nodded, and I realized in that moment that he believed me, that the fear that used to fill his face when she came around had been replaced by something steadier, because he'd watched me handle it enough times now to trust that I would. 2 officers arrived within 15 minutes. My wife tried to explain that she was just dropping off some of Caleb's belongings, that she was being a good person, that surely there was no harm in that, but she'd been ordered to have no contact and to stay away from the residence, and good intentions, real or performed, don't erase a court order. They arrested her in my driveway. I watched from the window as they put her in the back of the patrol car, and I felt no triumph, only a tired kind of relief, the feeling of a door finally closing that had been swinging on a broken hinge for months. Caleb came and stood next to me at the window, and neither of us said anything for a while, and then he said quietly that he'd never really believed she'd face any consequences. He said in his experience people like her always got away with it, always talked their way out, always ended up being the ones everyone felt sorry for. I put my hand on his shoulder and told him that wasn't going to happen this time, and for once I actually believed what I was telling him. The arrest changed things, and not just legally. Word got around, the way it always does, and this time the word carried a fact that was hard to argue with, which is that my wife had been arrested for refusing to stay away from a man and his teenage son who had a court order protecting them from her. It's difficult to keep telling a story about a devoted wife wronged by a paranoid husband when that wife is being fingerprinted for violating a protection order. Some of the friends who had pulled away started to reconsider. Greg, the one who'd called first and listened least, sent me a message a couple of weeks later. It was awkward and halting, and he didn't fully apologize. Men like Greg rarely do, but he said he'd heard some things that didn't line up with what he'd been told, and that he felt bad about how their earlier conversation had gone, and that if I ever wanted to grab a beer, the offer was open. I appreciated the gesture more than I let on, but I also noticed that I didn't feel any rush to take him up on it. Something had shifted in me during those months. I'd learned who showed up when the story was ugly and inconvenient, and who only showed up once it was safe again, and I found I wanted to spend my time on the first kind of person. Paul was the first kind. So was my brother Daniel, who drove 3 hours the weekend after the arrest just to sit in my kitchen and drink coffee and watch a game with me and Caleb, not because anything needed to be said, but because he wanted to be in the room. So was Nadia Foster, the school counselor, who checked in on Caleb without being asked and made sure his teachers knew he'd been through something hard, so that when his grades started climbing back up, they understood what that climb had cost him. I started to see that the family I actually had was smaller than the one I'd thought I had, but it was real in a way the larger one never had been, and I'd traded a wide circle of people who liked the easy version of me for a small circle of people who'd stood next to me through the hard version, and that was not a bad trade. Caleb kept getting better. It wasn't a straight line. There were setbacks, nights when something reminded him of those 2 years and he'd go quiet, mornings when he woke up braced for attention that was no longer there there and had to remind himself it was gone. But the trajectory was clear. He rejoined the group chat with his friends that he'd gone silent on for most of the previous year. He asked the girl in his chemistry class to a school dance and she said yes, and I drove them and a couple of their friends and listened to them laugh in the back seat about things I didn't understand, and it was the best 40 minutes I'd had in a long time. He started staying after practice to help the younger kids on the team, coaching them the way I used to coach him, and his coach told me at a game that Caleb had become one of the leaders on the team, one of the ones the little guys looked up to, and I had to turn away for a second because I didn't want the coach to see my face. The boy who'd spent 2 years making himself smaller was taking up space in the world again, and every inch of it felt like something we'd fought for and won. I want to be honest about the fact that I still had bad days too. There were nights I lay awake doing the math on how many warning signs I'd waved off, how many times Caleb had tried to tell me something in his quiet, careful way, and I'd been too busy protecting my own picture of a happy family to hear him. There were moments the guilt would rise up out of nowhere, in the middle of a grocery store, at a red light, and I'd have to breathe through it. My therapist told me that guilt like that is really grief wearing a mask. Grief for the years I couldn't get back, and the version of myself I wished I'd been. She said the most useful thing I could do with it was to let it make me a better father going forward instead of a paralyzed one looking backward. So that's what I tried to do. Every time the guilt came, I turned it into an action, a conversation with Caleb, a meal we cooked together, a Saturday I kept clear so we could do nothing in particular in a house that finally felt like ours. One evening she suggested I write Caleb a letter, not to hand him, just to write, everything I wished I'd done differently and everything I was proud of him for, and I did, and it ran to 4 pages, and by the end of it my hand was cramped and my eyes were wet, and I understood something I hadn't before, which was that the guilt and the love were the same size, that I felt this bad precisely because he mattered this much, and that a father who could hurt this much over 2 lost years was not a father who had abandoned his son, only one who had been slow to wake up. Slowly the bad days got further apart, and the good days stopped feeling like something I was borrowing against a bill that would eventually come due. There was a moment near the end of that season that showed me how far Caleb had come. We were at the grocery store, the two of us, arguing good-naturedly about whether we needed a second box of cereal, when I looked up and saw Bianca, my wife's friend, the one she'd been staying with, coming down the same aisle. My first instinct was to steer Caleb the other way, to protect him from an awkward encounter, the way I'd spent years trying to protect him from things. But before I could move, Bianca had already seen us, and her face did something complicated, and she opened her mouth like she was going to say something pointed. Caleb spoke first. He said hello to her by name, polite and even, and told her to have a good day, and then he turned back to me and asked, completely unbothered, whether we were getting the second box or not. It was such a small thing, and it undid me a little. A year earlier, the sight of that woman would have made him shrink into himself. Now he greeted her like she was any stranger, gave her nothing to work with, and moved on with his day, because she simply didn't have the power over him that she used to. Bianca stood there for a second with her mouth still half open, and then walked off without a word. In the car afterward, Caleb said, almost to himself, that he used to think people like that were bigger than they actually were, and that up close they were kind of small. I told him that was one of the truest things I'd ever heard, and I meant it. The divorce itself dragged for a while before it broke. At first, my wife did exactly what Diane predicted she would. Her lawyer filed a response contesting the property division, arguing that the prenup was signed under pressure, that she'd contributed to the household during the marriage, that the house had appreciated in value during the 2 years she lived in it, and she was owed a share of that appreciation. It was a long shot, and everyone involved knew it, but a long shot can still cost you months of your life and a lot of money, and I think that was partly the point. She wanted it to hurt. If she couldn't have the house, she could at least make sure the process of losing it took as long and cost as much as possible. Diane walked me through each filing calmly, and she kept reminding me that the law was on my side, that the prenup was clean and properly executed, and that I'd been advised by counsel, and so had my wife, and that no judge was going to throw all that out because someone had buyer's remorse about a document they'd signed with their eyes open. For a few weeks, it looked like it might actually go to a contested hearing, and I braced myself for another courtroom, another performance, another round of my wife in a soft cardigan telling a story about a paranoid husband and a spoiled child. I hated the idea of putting Caleb through more of it, of having the details of his 2 hard years laid out again in a public record. Diane told me she'd do everything she could to keep him off the stand, that his written statement and the counselor's notes would probably be enough, but there were no guarantees, and the not knowing sat heavy on both of us. I told Caleb only what he needed to know, that his stepmother was fighting the divorce over the house and that it might take a while, and he took it better than I expected. He said, and I'll never forget this, that he wasn't scared of her anymore, that she'd already done the worst thing she could do, which was make him feel like he didn't belong in his own home, and that she'd lost that fight the day the locks changed. A 16-year-old said that to me, and I understood that he'd come further in a few months than I had in years. Then, 3 months after I changed the locks, Diane called with unexpected news. My wife's lawyer had contacted her to say they were dropping the contest and accepting the divorce terms as written. She wasn't going to fight over property division or try to claim any part of the house or my other assets. She just wanted the process over as quickly as possible. Diane said she was surprised because she'd expected her to drag things out for months. I asked what changed, and she said she didn't know for sure, but she suspected a few things had converged. The arrest had weakened my wife's position badly, giving Diane a clear pattern of misconduct to point to. The financial discovery had exposed exactly how weak her hand was, how much debt she was carrying, how little she could afford to keep paying 2 lawyers to chase a house she was never going to get. And And Diane suspected that at some point, my wife had finally sat down with a lawyer who was willing to be blunt with her, who explained in plain language exactly how ironclad the prenup was and how badly the restraining order violations would play in front of any judge. Whatever the reason, she'd given up. The divorce would be finalized in 60 days, ending a 2-year marriage that never should have happened. I felt relief more than sadness when Diane gave me the news. There was a small part of me that felt something like grief, not for my wife, but for the family I'd thought I was building, for the version of the future I'd stood at that vineyard and promised myself was coming. But mostly, I just felt ready to move on, ready to close this chapter and focus on rebuilding the peaceful home Caleb and I had, before I'd complicated everything by getting married. Diane said she'd send over the final paperwork for me to review and sign. After that, it was just a matter of waiting for the court to process everything and issue the final decree. She congratulated me on getting through one of the hardest things a person could go through, and she said something I've thought about a lot since, which was that most people in my position never make it this far, that they talk themselves out of it, that they choose the comfortable lie over the hard truth because the hard truth costs too much. She said I should be proud that I chose my son. I thanked her for all her help and told her I couldn't have done it without her guidance. After we hung up, I sat in my car for a few minutes just breathing. It was almost over. Soon my wife would be officially out of our lives, and Caleb and I could really start fresh. Caleb and I developed new routines over those last 2 months of waiting for the divorce to finalize. Sunday mornings became cooking mornings, where he'd decide he wanted to learn to make something, and we'd fumble through it together, burning the first batch of pancakes and getting the second batch right, attempting an omelet that came out more like scrambled eggs, working our way up to a full breakfast that we were both ridiculously proud of. He turned out to have a real interest in it, and I bought him a couple of cookbooks, and some evenings I'd come home to find he'd made dinner for the 2 of us, and we'd sit at the table, the same table where he used to eat alone in his room to avoid a sigh, and he'd talk the whole way through the meal without once bracing for someone to tell him to stop. Friday nights became game nights, sometimes a movie, sometimes an actual soccer match we'd watch together and argue about, sometimes just the 2 of us playing the video game he'd retrieved from a box in the garage, the one his stepmother had decided didn't belong in the living room, now hooked back up to the main TV where it belonged. We talked more openly now about everything, from school to college plans to the girl in his chemistry class who had become, somewhere along the way, his girlfriend. He asked me for advice on things he never would have brought up when my wife lived here, and I did my best to give it without pretending I had all the answers, because one thing those 2 years had taught me was that certainty is not the same as wisdom, and that I'd been very certain for a very long time about a marriage that was quietly hurting my child. Our relationship wasn't magically perfect, because we still had disagreements about curfew and screen time and the state of his room, which was, if anything, messier now that he felt free to actually live in it. But there was trust again, in a way there hadn't been for 2 years. He knew I would always choose him over anyone else. He knew this was his home, and nobody was going to push him out of it, not with a comment or a sigh or a boxed-up trophy or a sentence about finding somewhere else to live. We were learning to be a family of 2 again, the way we'd been before I met her, and it felt right in a way that the family of 3 never had. The house was peaceful. Caleb was happy. I was healing. We were going to be okay. Caleb turned 17 during those last 2 months, and his birthday became a kind of quiet milestone for both of us, though neither of us said so out loud. The year before, his birthday had been a strained thing. My wife had made a comment about how much the cake cost, and had disappeared into the bedroom before we'd even finished singing, and Caleb had opened his presents quickly and quietly, the way he did everything back then, like he was trying not to take up too much air. This year I asked him what he wanted to do, and he said he wanted to have his friends over. Just that, have his friends over, at the house, without having to ask permission or worry about the noise or wonder whether someone was keeping a tally of the pizza. So that's what we did. 8 teenage boys and the girl from chemistry filled up the living room and the backyard, loud and hungry and completely at ease, and I stood in the kitchen making round after round of food, and listening to my son laugh in the middle of it all, in the center of a home that was finally fully his. At one point, he caught my eye across the room and gave me a small nod, and I understood everything he meant by it, and I nodded back. His friends' parents started coming around more too, dropping kids off, picking them up, lingering in the driveway to chat. A few of them, I realized, had heard my wife's version of things back when it was making the rounds, and I could see them recalibrating as they got to know the actual house, the actual father, the actual kid, none of which matched the story they'd been told. One mother, dropping her son off for a study session, told me quietly that she'd always thought there was something off about my wife, the way she talked about Caleb when he wasn't around, the little digs dressed up as concern, and that she was glad Caleb had someone in his corner. I thanked her, and I didn't feel the need to defend myself or relitigate anything, which was new for me. For months, I'd felt like I had to explain, to prove, to convince. Now I just let the house speak for itself. A happy kid is a hard thing to argue with. The 60 days moved slower than I expected, and also somehow faster. Slower because I was aware of them, aware of the count, the way you become aware of the last few days of a long trip. Faster because the days themselves were full of ordinary things, the small machinery of a life being rebuilt. I coached Caleb's team through the end of their season, standing on the sideline the way I had when he was 7, except now he was one of the oldest kids out there, and I got to watch him become the kind of teammate the younger ones wanted to be near. I fixed the porch step that had cracked during all that pounding months ago, the one physical scar the house had from that night, and it felt good to make it whole again, to smooth over the last visible mark she'd left. I cleaned out the garage, finally, the garage that had become a kind of holding cell for the pieces of our life she'd tried to disappear, and I brought the rest of it back into the light, hung Caleb's old artwork back in the hallway, put the family photos back on the shelves, reclaimed room by room the parts of the house that had quietly gone dim. There was one afternoon during that stretch that I keep coming back to. It was nothing really. A Tuesday. I'd taken a half day off work, and Caleb got home from school, and neither of us had anything we had to do. We ended up in the backyard, tossing a soccer ball back and forth, not even really playing, just passing it, the way we used to when he was little, and I was teaching him to trap the ball out of the air. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. The sun was going down, and the light was that gold color it gets in the late afternoon, and I remember thinking that this, exactly this, was the thing my wife had been trying to take from us. Not the house, not the money. This, the ease of it, the safety of a kid being able to stand in his own backyard and not brace for anything. She'd spent 2 years trying to convince my son that he was a burden, an expense, a problem to be managed, and eventually removed. And here he was, 17 and unafraid, passing a ball to his father in the last light of an ordinary day, home. I had to stop for a second and pretend I'd lost the ball in the sun so he wouldn't see me get emotional over a game of catch. He saw anyway. He didn't say anything. He just jogged over and bumped my shoulder with his and told me I was getting slow in my old age, and we both laughed, and we kept playing until it got too dark to see. The divorce finalized on a Tuesday morning in late January. Diane called me at work to say the judge had signed the papers and it was officially done. No dramatic courtroom scene or last-minute arguments, just signatures on legal documents that ended a 2-year marriage. I thanked her for everything she'd done to help me through the process. She said I'd done the hard part by standing up for myself and my son. After we hung up, I sat at my desk staring at my computer screen for a few minutes, processing the fact that I was no longer married, that the woman who had looked at my son and told him to find somewhere else to live was now, legally and completely, a stranger with no claim on any of it. Not the house, not me, not him. The relief I felt was bigger than any sadness. It was the kind of relief that settles into your body, that loosens something in your chest you didn't know had been clenched for 2 years. That evening, I picked Caleb up after practice and told him we were going out to celebrate. He asked what we were celebrating, and I said our fresh start. We went to his favorite restaurant, a loud, cheerful place with terrible lighting and the best burgers in town, and we ordered too much food and talked about redecorating the living room now that we could make it feel like ours again. He wanted to knock down the formal, museum-like arrangement my wife had insisted on and turn it into a real room, a room for sprawling and gaming and having friends over, and we sketched it out on a napkin between bites. We talked about a summer road trip, driving up the coast, staying in cheap motels and little beach towns, no plan, no schedule, just the two of us and a full tank of gas and however far we felt like going. Life wasn't perfect, and I was still stressed about money after 2 lawyers and a locksmith and everything else, and I was still carrying some hurt from everything that happened, some of it his, some of it mine, but my son was happy and safe in his own home. That was everything that mattered to me. We were moving forward together as a family of 2. For the first time in 2 years, our house felt peaceful.